ever say something in English that sounds correct in your language, but strange in American English? Hi there, I'm Jason, and this is Jason's Easy English, a podcast that helps you improve your English and learn about American culture with clear, understandable episodes in authentic, everyday language. Today, we're talking about a very common problem for Brazilian and other Latin American learners, direct translations. I'll share 7 direct translations to avoid in American English, and I'll show you what Americans usually say instead to sound more natural. And a quick reminder, if you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to follow or subscribe on your favorite platform. All right, let's go ahead and get started. When you learn English, it's very normal to translate in your head. I do the same thing when I speak Portuguese or Spanish. But sometimes a sentence that sounds perfect in your language may sound strange or unnatural to Americans. Let's start with a classic example. Many learners say something like, I have 30 years. This comes directly from Portuguese and Spanish, where you use ter or tener to talk about age. But in American English, we don't use to have for age. We use the verb to be. So the correct sentence is something like, I am 30 years old, or she is 40 years old. The years old part is part of the natural phrase used when talking about age in English. So don't just say years, like, I am 34 years. It's years old. I am 40 years old. However, you can also leave the years old part off and simply say, I'm 35. She's 42. But remember, always use a form of the verb to be. I am, she is, he is, they are, and not a form of the verb to have. Now, number 2. Here's an example. I didn't make my homework. I didn't make my homework. This happens because the verbs fazer or hacer can mean to make or to do. So learners often guess, and sometimes they get it wrong. They use the wrong verb in English. In American English, we don't make homework, we do homework. People will understand if you say make homework, but it sounds like a bad translation. It doesn't sound natural to native speakers. So, I didn't do my homework. She did her homework. We need to do our homework. Do homework. It's just one example of that difficulty with the verbs fazer and hacer. Next one is very common. Here's the incorrect, unnatural form. Something like, I am with doubt, or I have doubt. Think it through in Spanish or Portuguese. Where is this coming from? I'm with doubt or I have doubt. These feel very natural in Portuguese and Spanish, but Americans don't say them this way. Instead, Americans say, I'm not sure, when they don't feel certain about something. And if your doubt, a dúvida, la duda, is really a question, uma pergunta, tipo, eu tenho uma dúvida. You can say, I have a question. I have a question, not I have a doubt. Moving on to bad translation number 4. Be careful not to say, please, lend attention. Lend attention or borrow attention. This incorrect form comes from prestar atenção or prestar atención in español. But in English, we don't lend attention, we pay attention. So the natural expression in English is, please, pay attention. Be sure to pay attention. This is a phrase you'll hear a lot in classrooms, meetings, and conversations. Speaking of classrooms, number 5 is a very important one also. This has to do with the translation of the verb aprovar or aprobar. The incorrect form, the bad translation is, I approved the test, or I just approved that exam. Again, this comes from aprovar uma prova, or aprovar un examen, which do mean to succeed on an exam in Portuguese or Spanish, of course. But in American English, approve, to approve, only means to give permission or a positive assessment, like when a boss approves your vacation or a parent approves of something that their child has done. If you succeed on a test or an exam, you should say, I passed the test. I passed the test. Or, eu preciso aprovar naquela prova. I need to pass the test. And the opposite is also quite important. If you don't succeed on the exam or the test, you say, I failed the test. This is how we express the idea of reprovar or reprovar. I failed the test. So we have to pass a test if the result is positive, and to fail a test if the result is negative. Now the next one is a classic false friend, a false cognate. Resist the urge to say something like, I pretend to learn English, when you mean that you want to or plan to learn English. Again, the unnatural, incorrect form is, I pretend to learn English, because in your mind, you're translating from eu pretendo aprender inglês, right? In English, pretend does not mean to plan or to intend. Pretend in English means to act like something is true when it's not. So the correct phrase is, I plan to learn English, or I want to learn English. Now, on to our last bad translation. This one is more general. It has to do with using the verbs to arrive and to return too often in English. Because learners often learn, okay, chegar or llegar is to arrive, and voltar or regresar is to return. But you need to be careful because these verbs, to arrive and to return, are a little bit formal in English. So, somebody who speaks Portuguese or Spanish and is learning English might say, I arrived home, or ask, did you arrive yet? But in everyday English, we usually say, I got home, or did you get there yet? Did you get home yet? Get home, or get there, sounds much more natural in daily conversation. Now, the same is true with the verb to return. Don't overuse this in American English. Instead of saying, I will return at 8, that sounds very formal. Americans usually say, I'll come back at 8, or I'll be back at 8. So, to come back, or to be back, or even to get back are more common and natural sounding than to return. These small changes can make a big difference in how natural your English sounds. And one quick cultural note about English and learning languages in general. In the United States, sounding natural is often more important than sounding formal or perfect. In general, making mistakes and correcting them in real time is just part of speaking any language. And Americans change sentences, correct themselves, and adjust their words all the time. That's just a normal part of communication. Again, don't worry about being perfect. All right, I hope that was interesting and understandable. But before I let you go, let's review the main points of today's episode. Today, we learned natural forms in American English for commonly translated expressions. Again, here are examples of the more natural expressions that Americans use. So instead of, I have 30 years? I am 30 years old. I'm 30 years old. I didn't make my homework? No, that doesn't sound good. Instead, say, I didn't do my homework. And be very careful with translations using fazer or hacer. Instead of I'm with a doubt or I have a doubt, say I'm not sure or I have a question. Remember, in American English, uma dúvida, una duda, is not a doubt. It's usually a question. Instead of lend attention or borrow attention, remember to say, please pay attention. In English, we pay attention. Pagamos atención. Instead of I approved the test, we say, I passed the test. Or if you didn't pass, you failed the test or the exam. And then finally, remember not to overuse the verbs to arrive and to return. It's better to say, I got home late and I'll come back at 8. These simple sentences show how Americans really speak. Using expressions like these helps you avoid poor direct translation and sound clearer, more natural, and more confident in American English. All right, that's all I have for today's lesson. I hope you were able to understand most of the episode and learned something new. Be sure to follow or subscribe to my podcast, and please share Jason's Easy English with your friends who are also learning English. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you at the next episode.